I was picking up a prescription at the CVS on Maple Grove when I saw her. My daughter. My Ivy. She was standing near the entrance with her coat buttoned all the way up even though it wasn't that cold. Her hair pulled back in a way she never wore it. And next to her was my granddaughter Rosie, 6 years old, holding a paper bag that looked like it came from the food pantry 2 blocks down. I froze in the middle of the parking lot. Ivy hadn't answered my calls in 3 weeks. I told myself she was busy, that Marcus kept her busy. That was always the excuse I made, because what else could I do? She was 42 years old and I was just her mother. I walked toward her and she saw me before I reached her. For a half second something crossed her face. Not happiness. Something more like shame. "Mum," she said. I looked at the bag in Rosie's hands. Then I looked at my daughter's face. The hollows under her eyes, the way her collar was pulled up higher than it needed to be, the fact that she was wearing the same shoes I'd seen her in at Thanksgiving 4 months ago, and those shoes had been worn then. I said, "Ivy, what is going on?" She looked down at Rosie, then back at me. She said, "Can we not do this here?" I took her to my car. Rosie sat in the back seat with a granola bar I found in my purse, and I turned to my daughter and I said, "Tell me everything, right now, from the beginning." What she told me took 40 minutes. By the end of it, my hands were shaking. Ivy married Marcus 11 years ago. I want to be honest here. I never fully warmed to him. There was something about the way he talked, always smooth, always with an answer ready, always making you feel like you were the one who didn't understand the situation. But Ivy loved him. She was happy, or she seemed happy, and I was 63 years old, and I had learned that a mother's job eventually becomes staying in her lane. They bought a house in Clarksville, Tennessee in 2018. A nice house, 3 bedrooms, good school district. Ivy was an occupational therapist at a rehabilitation center downtown making good money. Marcus worked in commercial real estate, or he said he did. The details were always vague when I asked, and he changed the subject with a joke or a compliment, and somehow the conversation would move on. Rosie was born in 2019. I flew in for the birth and stayed 2 weeks. Marcus was charming the whole time, made breakfast every morning, told me how much Ivy meant to him. I drove home feeling foolish for ever doubting him. What I didn't know, what Ivy didn't fully know either, not yet, was that it had already started. The first thing Ivy noticed was small. A credit card statement that came in the mail for an account she didn't remember opening. She asked Marcus about it. He said he'd opened it for both of them to consolidate some of their travel expenses that he'd meant to tell her and that he was handling the payments. She said okay. She trusted him. That was 2020. The second thing was a letter from the IRS. Not a big letter, just a notice about a discrepancy in their joint filing. Marcus took the letter before she could read the details. He said it was a minor error his accountant had already corrected and that she didn't need to worry about it. She asked to see it. He said he'd already shredded it because the issue was resolved. She believed him. That was 2021. By 2022, Ivy was exhausted, working full-time, raising Rosie, managing the house because Marcus was always traveling for work. She had headaches she couldn't explain. She was forgetting things, appointments, whether she'd paid a bill, conversations she'd had. She told me on the phone that she was stressed and probably needed to see a doctor. I told her to slow down. I didn't know what I was really hearing. Marcus told her she was forgetting things because she'd always been disorganized with money. He said this gently. He said it the way you say something to someone you love, kindly, with a little smile. He started handling all the finances. She let him because she was tired, because he said he was good at it, and because some part of her had started to believe what he was telling her about herself. That's the part that's hardest for me to sit with, even now. That my daughter, who graduated summa cum laude, who ran a half marathon at 38, who could explain the neurological basis of motor recovery to anyone who'd listen, started to believe she was bad with money and too scattered to keep track of her own accounts. That's what Marcus did to her. slowly, quietly, over years. In early 2023, Ivy tried to log into their joint checking account online and found the password had been changed. She asked Marcus. He said he'd updated it for security reasons and wrote the new one down for her on a post-it. When she logged in, the balance was $340. She'd had $14,000 in that account 3 months earlier. She asked him what happened. He told her she'd been spending. Did she not remember the new appliances, the repairs to the deck, the trip she'd booked for her friend's bachelorette weekend? She said she remembered the bachelorette trip, but not the rest. He brought out a folder. She said he always had a folder ready, which tells you something, with receipts, her name on all of them, her signature, or something that looked like it. She told me she stood in the kitchen holding those receipts and feeling like the floor was moving. She said, "Mum, I know I didn't buy a $3,200 refrigerator. I know I didn't." But he had the paper right there, and I started thinking, what if I really don't remember? What if something is wrong with me? That's gaslighting. I didn't have a word for it back then, but I know it now. She didn't call me. She didn't call anyone. Because Marcus had also spent 2 years very carefully suggesting that her family, meaning me, had never really supported their marriage, that I was critical, that I made her feel small. So she'd been pulling away from me gradually, and I'd been telling myself it was just life, just distance, just the way adult children drift. She pulled away because he needed her isolated. In the spring of 2023, Marcus told Ivy they needed to refinance the house. Interest rates, he said. Better terms. She signed the paperwork he put in front of her at the kitchen table while Rosie was in the other room watching a movie. She didn't read it carefully. She trusted him. She'd been trained by then to trust him and distrust herself. The paperwork was not a refinance. She didn't find that out until 8 months later, when a letter arrived addressed to a company called MR Holding LLC, care of their home address, confirming the completion of a property transfer. She Googled MR Holding LLC. She found nothing. She asked Marcus. He said it was a business entity he'd set up for tax purposes, and the house was technically held in the LLC's name, now for asset protection, which was completely standard, and their attorney had recommended it. He told her she wouldn't understand the details, and he'd explain it when she wasn't so tired. She let it go. She let it go because by then she had been so thoroughly convinced that she was forgetful, emotional, and bad at understanding financial matters, that she accepted an explanation that should have sent her straight to a lawyer. January of 2024. Marcus told her he was going to a conference in Atlanta for 10 days. He kissed Rosie goodbye. He told Ivy he loved her. He took 2 suitcases. He did not come back. At first, she thought something had happened to him. She called his cell. No answer. She called his office number. Disconnected. She called the hotel in Atlanta he'd given her. No reservation under his name. She called his brother, a man named Curtis I had met once at a Christmas party and had not liked. And Curtis said he didn't know where Marcus was, which was probably the only true thing Marcus's brother had said in years. She waited. She told herself there was an explanation. After 2 weeks, she went to the bank. Not their joint account. She'd already seen what was in that. She went about the home equity line of credit that Marcus had mentioned once early in their marriage, saying they should have access to it for emergencies. She wanted to know the balance. The banker looked up the account. Then she looked at Ivy. Then she looked at her screen again. The home equity line of credit had been drawn down completely, every cent, over the previous 14 months, in increments small enough not to trigger alerts, a total of $87,000. And then the banker told her something else. The house Ivy had signed paperwork on, the house she'd thought was being refinanced, had been sold 6 months ago to MR Holding LLC for $243,000, well below market value. The sale was recorded, legal. Her signature was on the deed transfer. Ivy told me that she sat in that bank chair and she didn't cry. She said she felt something go very quiet inside her, the way it gets quiet right before a storm. She drove home. The house was still there, They hadn't changed the locks yet. She walked through every room. She packed clothes for herself and Rosie. She emptied what was left in her personal savings account, $1,800, and she left. She didn't come to me. She didn't call me. She told me in the car that day that she didn't come to me because she was ashamed. Because she had let this happen, she said, because she had signed things without reading them, and she had believed him when he told her she was scatterbrained, and she couldn't face me knowing all of that. I reached over and I held her hand and I said, "Ivy, look at me." She looked at me. She looked at me. I said, "You didn't let anything happen. He did this to you on purpose, over years, very carefully. That is not the same thing." She started crying then. She hadn't cried yet, she told me. In all of it, she hadn't let herself cry. I want to be clear about something. I am 67 years old. I retired from the Clarksville City Clerk's office 4 years ago. I am not a dramatic person. I don't have a lot of money. What I have is a 2-bedroom house that's paid off, a 2019 Buick, and 40 years of watching how systems work, because that was my job. And I have a friend named Joyce who was a paralegal for 26 years before she retired, and Joyce is the kind of person you want in your corner when something like this happens. I called Joyce from the parking lot of that CVS while Ivy was inside, with Rosie getting a cup of hot chocolate from the little cafe counter. I told Joyce everything in about 8 minutes. Joyce was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Get her a family law attorney and a forensic accountant. Today, if you can. Don't touch the bank accounts, don't contact Marcus, don't contact the brother, and write down everything she remembers, dates, amounts, documents she signed, everything while it's fresh." That's what we did. The attorney Ivy found, a woman named Rebecca, sharp as anyone I've ever met, took one look at the timeline and said this had fraud written all over it. The signatures on the deed transfer were almost certainly forged or signed under false pretenses, which in Tennessee carries the same legal weight. The MR Holding LLC was a shell company registered in Nevada, with Marcus listed as sole member, not Ivy. She had never been a member. She had signed paperwork transferring her home to a company she didn't own and didn't know existed. The forensic accountant found more. The credit cards, there were 4 of them, opened in Ivy's name over 3 years without her knowledge. Total balance, $61,000. The IRS notice from 2021 had been about unreported income Marcus had run through their joint return, income from what appeared to be a side operation involving falsified invoices billed to commercial clients, small amounts under the radar, but it had triggered scrutiny that he'd managed to bury. And the home equity line, the $87,000, had been transferred in pieces to an account that traced back, eventually, to Marcus's brother Curtis. Curtis wasn't just aware of what Marcus was doing, Curtis was a partner in it. Rebecca contacted the Montgomery County District Attorney's Office. She also contacted the Tennessee Department of Commerce and Insurance, which handles mortgage fraud. And because the fraudulent LLC crossed state lines, registered in Nevada, operated in Tennessee, there was a federal angle that brought in investigators from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Nashville. Marcus was located in Phoenix, Arizona. He had been there for 3 months, living in an apartment rented under a variation of his middle name. Curtis was still in Clarksville. He was arrested at his home on a Tuesday morning while he was apparently eating breakfast. I won't pretend I didn't feel something when I heard that. The charges took time to work out, these things always do. But here is what they eventually faced, Marcus: wire fraud, identity theft, mortgage fraud, fraudulent conveyance of real property, and opening financial accounts in another person's name without consent. In Tennessee, the identity theft charge alone carries up to 12 years. With the federal wire fraud charges stacked on top, he was looking at significant time. He took a plea agreement, 14 years, with the possibility of parole after 10, plus full restitution ordered by the court. Curtis, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and receipt of stolen funds. He received 7 years and was ordered to repay his share, jointly with Marcus. The house. The sale to MR Holding LLC was voided by the court as a fraudulent conveyance. The shell company was dissolved. The The property was returned to Ivy's name. The below-market sale price, which had been paid using the stolen home equity funds, was traced, and the court addressed it in the restitution order. The credit cards are being disputed through the fraud process. 3 of the 4 issuers have already agreed to remove the balances from Ivy's credit report. Her score, which had dropped to 511 at its lowest point, is already recovering. The $87,000 from the home equity line is part of the restitution order. Whether she sees all of it depends on what Marcus and Curtis have left by the time collections are enforced. Rebecca told her to expect to see some of it, probably not all of it. That's the honest answer. Ivy and Rosie stayed with me for 7 months. Rosie slept in my sewing room, which I cleared out and painted a colour she picked herself, a pale yellow she called buttery. She started 2nd grade at the elementary school 6 blocks from my house. She made a best friend named Sophia. She seems okay. Children are more resilient than we give them credit for, or maybe they need to be, and so they find a way. Ivy went back to her job at the rehabilitation centre. They'd held her position. She'd taken FMLA leave when things fell apart, and her supervisor, a woman who'd known her for 8 years, had made sure the paperwork was handled quietly and correctly. That was a grace I didn't expect, but was deeply grateful for. She started seeing a therapist, a woman who specializes in financial abuse and coercive control. She'd never heard those words applied to her own life before. She told me one evening, sitting at my kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile, that the hardest part wasn't the money or the house or even the fear. The hardest part was the moment when she realized that the person she'd been for the last 4 years, scattered, forgetful, bad at managing things, wasn't who she was at all. That Marcus had constructed that version of her on purpose, install it like a piece of software because it made her easier to control. She said, "Mom, I have to figure out who I actually am again." I said, "You're an occupational therapist who helps people relearn how to use their hands and walk again after strokes. I think you know something about starting over." She looked at me for a second. Then she laughed. Not a big laugh, a quiet one, but real. She's back in her house now. The locks were changed before she moved back in. The house needed some work. It had been occupied by a renter Marcus had placed there through the LLC, and renters are not always kind to houses. But it was her house, in her name, in the school district Rosie knew. She painted the front door red. She said she'd always wanted a red door, and Marcus had said it would hurt the resale value. She called me after she did it, and she said, "Mom, I painted the door." I said, "What colour?" She said, "Red." Exactly the red I wanted. I told her it sounded perfect. I drove over that weekend to see it. Stood in her driveway in the November cold, looking at that red door, and I thought about all the things my daughter had survived, without me knowing she was surviving them. All the years of being slowly diminished by a man who smiled while he did it. And I thought about the fact that she was still here, standing on the other side of that door, still herself, even after all of it. She opened the door before I could knock. Rosie ran past her in socked feet and grabbed me around the middle and said, "Grandma, come see my room. I have a reading nook now." And I went inside. That's all you need sometimes. Someone opening the door before you can knock because they were already watching for you. Because you are the person they know will always come.